I don't intend to speak for so long, but thanks for the invite to come and speak. Because to speak about revolution, it's on the one hand it can seem very abstract, but on the other hand, if we look at the world that we're living in at the present time, it's one of tremendous crises, plural. Because if you look different ways around the world, whether it be the economic situation, which is extremely unstable in general. We've got, in most countries of the world, falling living standards through inflation, and also in some countries through increased unemployment. We have an ongoing environmental crisis, which is reflected in different forms. In some parts of the world, drought situations. In other parts of the world, flooding. In some places, a mixture of the two, depending on the time of year. We have a sharpening tensions between the world powers. We see the competition between the different world powers to extend their spheres of influence against rivals. We see that particularly in Africa at the present time, where we've got a race, particularly between, if you like, the US, the EU, and China, for different, and to a certain extent Russia as well, for different spheres of influence inside Africa. But we see it in the Pacific region, where the tensions growing between the US and China at the present time, not just verbal tensions, but also the increasing military expenditure. Most countries in the world are seeing an increase in military spending at the present time, sometimes quite big increases in military spending, at the same time as they're saying they haven't got money for other things which are going on. And then against that unstable world situation, we also have the special crisis here in Britain, where we're witnessing, let's put it bluntly, a deepening of the decline of British capitalism. That's what it means. That's what's actually happening here. The crisis in the last few days over the so-called aero concrete, which isn't really concrete, what is that from? That's from cheap building over 30, 40 years. It started in the 1950s, a cheap way of building. It was a cheap substitute for harder concrete. Because I haven't got time to go into the reasons for it, but that's what it reflects. And now it's coming to an end. And the government has panicked in the last few days because there have been more cases of ceilings and roofs collapsing, and they don't want that to happen and injure especially children and teachers in the run-up to the election. That's why they're panicked now. One of the first times one of these schools collapsed was in London in 1973. A roof collapsed, a whole roof collapsed in a secondary school in London, 1970. It's not unknown, but it reflects the general decline. Leave aside everything else. The fact that in Britain there is a decline in living standards, the infrastructure is decaying. We see all these things which are actually going on. And there's a widespread feeling in different parts of the world that things can't continue as they are. Something's got to change. That's a general feeling. There's a dissatisfaction. Although at the present time, we have to say, there is immense confusion as to what that change should be. People don't know. They don't know, but they feel we can't go on in this way. But something has got to change. And this will get reflected in different ways. In Britain, we're in this sort of pre-election period. It's not certain what will happen with the election in Britain. You can't guarantee that Labour will win. And I'd say that there's not going to be much hopes in the Labour Party, except that possibly they'll be better than the present lot. That'll be it won't be big enthusiasm in the sense of expecting a lot from Labour, but there could be a situation in Britain where Labour either forms a majority government or leads some sort of coalition. It's not clear at this minute. And then, inevitably, there'll be an element of disappointment of what Labour does, which will kick in sooner or later, because they're not going to do that much. And in that situation, you could get movements developing. People think, well, we've got to act for ourselves. A bit like what we've seen with the strike movement in the recent period in Britain. We're faced with a dramatic drop in living standards. There was a feeling we've got to do something. And those in organised industry where they had a bit of muscle were able to win, not to mitigate, to reduce some of the impact in the fall in the falling living standards. At the same time, we have to be clear, in Britain, like in other countries as well, that disappointment with a Labour government can lead to a polarisation. in society, and if there's no answer from the left, it'll be the far right which will give an answer. You take the situation in Germany at the present time, the equivalent of the Labour Party in Germany is the major party in the German national government. The opinion polls now consistently, for nearly a year now in Germany, have shown that the second biggest party in the opinion polls in Germany is a far-right populist party, which has got elements within it who are sort of close to the fascists. No, it's not the whole party, but it's the second biggest party in Germany. It's 21% in the opinion polls in Germany at the present time. The German equivalent of the Labour Party is 15-16% in the opinion polls, and it's currently leading the government. Now, I'm not going to go into the situation there, but things are they're going to polarizing. At the same time, there's a general feeling, and something has to be done. And that sort of feeling, the idea that something needs to change, can lead not just to developments in opinion polls, but it can also lead to mass movements as well, to actually movements which actually develop. And that's what we're discussing today, because the question isn't just simply when there'll be movements, it isn't simply will there be revolutions, but what happens to those movements, what happens to the revolutions which actually develop. And this is not simply a British issue, it's a worldwide issue. You just look what has happened, in some of the events around the world in the recent period. Earlier this year, you had a series of big strikes and protests in France against the French government's attempt to increase the retirement age in France. It was a policy which was overwhelmingly unpopular. The French president could not get the policy through the parliament. Instead, he used a clause in the French constitution which allows the president to, by decree, impose new laws. It didn't go through the parliament. So, faced with the opposition in the opinion polls, even in the parliament, where he wasn't certain he could get it through the parliament, the French president imposed it, I decide, and that became the law. So you had this big movement against it, but it petered out. Not because it lacked support, but because of the question of what should it actually be doing. Well, how do you actually fight back? We've seen it in other situations in the recent period. We've seen in the last almost exactly a year now, we've seen protests develop in Iran after the murder of a young Iranian woman because she wasn't wearing the religious clothing properly. And the so-called morality police arrested her, beat her up, and she died as a result of that beating. That provoked an enormous movement in Iran. Very powerful movement in Iran, but the regime in Iran has overcome it. It hasn't crushed the opposition. It's not popular, but if you like, that particular movement has come to an end. Not because hundreds of people died in that movement. It wasn't just simply protesting. Literally hundreds of people died in it. Very self-sacrificing people. But it didn't, if you like, didn't topple the regime. It didn't achieve in its winning its objectives. And therefore, for us, the discussion is really that we understand that mass movements can develop, strike movements can develop in different countries, in different ways, at different times. The question is, how could they be successful? What steps are necessary to make these movements actually successful? And this links partly with the day-to-day struggles. We can have a discussion, for instance, about what tactics should be in the trade unions. Now, trade unions often struggle for immediate issues, whether it be wages, conditions, against victimizations, all these issues. And you can discuss what is the way to win in a trade union. It's not simply to say we need to struggle, yes, but what is the strategy? What is the best way to do it? We've seen that in the recent struggles in Britain, where different trade unions had different positions. We see it in the civil service, where the union leadership in the main civil service union backed off a continuous struggle. And therefore, the issue isn't simply just to say we need a strike or we need a struggle, but what is the strategy? What is the program which we put forward in order to win these sort of reforms, even though what trade unions can win, for instance, are very important, but they're only temporary. because sooner or later, you'll have to fight again. Whether it be like now in a time of inflation, where inflation is undermining all the time the existing wage agreements. You've got to keep fighting just to maintain the real standard of living. At the same time, any other concessions are temporary, because inevitably in a crisis, the bosses or ruling class will go on the offensive and they will say we cannot afford things anymore. That is why you have the propaganda in Britain and in other countries that the wages must not match inflation, they argue, because that will just cause the prices to get worse. That is the propaganda of the government. But what they're trying to do is to scare people to accept a drop in living standards, or not to fight against a drop in living standards. And that is really the central question. And therefore, when we're discussing movements, when we're discussing whether it be trade union movements, or in a certain way as well, when revolutions actually break out, the question of program, of how to build a movement and what the movement should fight for, is of absolutely key. And that's certainly the issue of, for instance, of how to defeat an autocratic regime, a dictatorship, was posed in Iran in the struggles of the last year. And therefore, this question is important. But also, what I want to concentrate a bit on in this introduction is the question of program, because we've seen in different cases, whether it be small groups just calling for revolution, which sounds very emotive and things like that, but if there's no content, what does it actually mean? Because, for instance, if you look sometimes at the far right, they also talk about revolution, but they mean it in a different way. We've got to be very precise in what we mean. We don't just say we want a revolution. What does it actually mean? What content is actually given to it? What is the program of that? And it's something which is posed very sharply when actually revolutions develop. Because when revolutions develop, they can be initially, for the people involved in revolution, particularly when they overthrow a dictatorship or an autocratic regime, a tremendous feeling of liberation. We have succeeded. And it can be like celebratory. People are so happy. I'm a bit old, and I went to Portugal in 1974, before many people were born here, obviously. But I was in Portugal in 1974 when a dictatorship which had lasted for decades was overthrown. And I went immediately after the dictatorship had been overthrown in Portugal. And it was one of the happiest experiences in my life. People were so happy. It was like, you can't really explain it. Imagine a sort of, maybe in the old days, imagine a sort of New Year's Eve party just extended for weeks. People were so happy. We'd liberated. We were free. Dictatorship had gone. We're solving our problems. And the point was that in discussing with people like that, and then with that sort of mood, there was a big fear of what was either one with others spoiling the party, saying, yes, it's very good. However, you've got to consolidate the victory. You've got to do this and this. This is what's necessary if you want to make sure that you consolidate. Because at that time, in Portugal in 1974, that people saw socialism in a general sense as the alternative. It was extremely popular. It was so popular that for years after the Portuguese Revolution of 74, in the Portuguese constitution, it said that the aim was to create a socialist society. They only changed that constitution and got rid of that clause when Portugal joined the EU, European Union, because they insisted you don't have that in the constitution. It was completely, at the end of it was purely symbolic. It just was a memory of the revolution of 74, 1975. But still, there was some emotional attachment, But they said, we want to join the EU, and if we join the EU, we've got to take that out of the constitution. So they changed the wording to a socially just society. They said, we don't need to talk about socialism anymore. We just talk in the constitution about a socially just society. That's what they did. But it reflected, if you like, the mood which existed in 74, 75. And the issue was that despite that feeling, there was no concrete, there was no general understanding, clear understanding of a concrete way forward. How could that program actually be implemented at the time? Obviously, there was a whole discussion about it that took place in Portugal. I'm not going to give a history of what happened in 74, 75 in Portugal now. But the point was that because overall there was no clarity about what should be done, how to consolidate the gains of the revolution, in the end, capitalism stabilized itself in Portugal. We see it in different ways in what happened in Egypt in 2011. In 2011, we had the removal of Mubarak, the authoritarian ruler of Egypt, by the military in the course of the mass movement of what was called the Arab Spring at that time. And there was again tremendous euphoria when Mubarak was forced out. Tremendous euphoria. People thought, yes, we've achieved something. And again, the question was posed: what should be done next? How to consolidate the victory? How to, if you like, really not just get rid of one ruler, but actually change society to meet to answer the problems, or have a program rather, which can answer the problems which existed. What was the way forward? And again, there was no clarity on this. There was no clear clarity as what should be concretely done. And then we had a series of situations develop in Egypt. Again, I'm not going to give a history of what happened in Egypt at that immediate time, but in the end, we had a new military ruler, Sisi, who's formerly now a civilian president, but in effect he's the military ruler of Egypt, who in some ways is more repressive than Mubarak was. In some ways is more repressive at the present time. And therefore, this question of program is absolutely key. Well, really a program of explaining what is needed to secure a victory and change society. And this is really where the role of revolutionaries come in. Because the role of revolutions really in any sort of movement of struggle, whether it be in strike movements, or whether it be in the bigger political movements, or even more in revolutions, is to have a clear program and then to see how to argue for that program. And our starting point is that the question of breaking with capitalism, that is the starting point. We start on that basis, that yes, we struggle for every improvement we can at the present time, but we realize that any improvements that we win are temporary and have to be fought for again and again. At the same time, we try to argue or explain why capitalism cannot provide a fundamental solution to either the economic, the social, the environmental, and all the other issues which humanity faces at the present time. And then, from our point, our work as a party is not just to declare that in abstract, but then to find a way to explain that in a popular way and to build support for it. Because if we're aiming to change society, we've got to build a mass movement which is going to change society. That is the key issue. And that you don't just get by simply lecturing, saying we just need a revolution or we just need social. We've got to argue it in a way. And this is what we attempt to do. And this is something which is of extreme importance, especially in a mass movement. Now, in the mass movement, we adapt how we speak. We try and have a dialogue. So we see the different starting points. You know, in my political activity, I've been in different revolutions. And for instance, I was in Iran in 1979 when the Shah regime was overthrown. And of course, as comrades may know, in the Iranian Revolution, there was a sort of broad, at once, because of the absence of a left, really, or the weakness of the left, there was a broad support for the idea of the Islamic Republic. And when I was in Iran, I tried to ask people, what do you mean by an Islamic Republic? And the major answer that I got was on the lines of a republic of the poor, you know, a republic which is not corrupt, etc., etc. And on this basis, you could start a dialogue. I mean, in the sense of saying, how do you get a republic of the poor? You know, concentrating on how do you get a republic which is not corrupt? What does it actually mean? And then try to introduce socialist ideas through that. Not immediately say having a discussion about religion. We leave that to one side, you know, at one moment, but arguing a republic of the poor, what does it actually mean in terms of democratic rights, in terms of how the economy is run, etc., etc., and arguing in that way, trying to have a dialogue. And that is the method which we approach. You know, when people are happy with a victory, you know, like when overthrowing when overthrowing a dictatorial regime, or even if they're people glad at last the Tories have been defeated, then we have to have a dialogue. What does it mean? If we're not going to have a failed Labour government, what needs to be done? What do we need to fight for? And arguing that way and having the sort of dialogue, and that's where, if you like, our programme comes in. It's I'm not just saying like have a programme, you know, sell a text or give a leaflets out or long articles out. It's a weapon to be used from the point of view of, if you like, winning support for the idea of changing society, and then at the same time seeing what is necessary to be done if we're going to change a society. And we understand that those ideas can find support on the basis of working people's experience of struggle, experience of life, combined with, if you like, the role of revolutionaries in explaining ideas. And what you find is in periods of upheaval, our ideas can match, if you like, match what the conclusions which working people are beginning to, if you like, draw themselves. It's not like we're presenting something from the outside. We base our propaganda on the experience of the movement, both nationally and also internationally as well. We try and use international events in order to explain, if you like, experiences which we need to do now. And this is, if you like, one of the questions which we face, you know, in Britain at the present time. You know, we have to, you know, if you like, both explain our general programme. We have to explain what the Labour Party is at the present time, the character of the Labour Party at the present time, why we need a new party, but at the same time, not just leave it from the point of view of a new party, but to argue, we have the flexibility to argue in different ways with different people, with those who are already drawing the conclusions that it's not, that we can't go on the present way, that we need a socialist alternative, etc. We need a break with capitalism. With those who are drawing that conclusion, we say this is what we're fighting for. This is what the Socialist Party is fighting for. And with others who think, well, we need a better sort of Labour Party. We need a Labour Party like it could have been under Corbyn. We would say, yes, we discuss, we can't work in the old Labour Party. That's become impossible. We need a new party, but then also we'd have to link it with explaining the programme which that party would need. Otherwise, a new party, if it was formed on the same sort of political basis which the old Labour Party was, again, wouldn't solve the problems. And we see that in different countries at the present time, where over the last 20, 30 years in different countries, there's been attempts to build new parties. Sometimes they've been relatively successful in elections, you know, getting significant votes, sometimes 10 or more % of the vote, you know, not necessarily winning vote, but winning, you know, considerable amount of support. But because while those efforts to form new parties were important, because they didn't have clarity in their programme and how they worked, they in the end very rapidly started to decline. So some of the bigger ones have almost disappeared. The ones which were once bigger, 20, 30 years ago, have almost disappeared. And therefore, this is what we're aiming for, and it's the role of ourselves and the question of our programme. The last point I want to make is an issue about which is linked with the question of revolution, which is the question of violence. That is an issue which comes up again and again, because the way the ruling class ruling classes in different countries paint the idea of revolution as they try and link it with violence, even though their own, if you like, history is filled with violence. I mean, we had the coronation this year, and really, if you take it historically, the claim of King Charles to be monarch lies on the fact that one of his ancestors killed Richard III, who was king, killed him, and therefore and then proclaimed himself king. That's, if you like, the formal, for what it's worth, the formal thing. It wasn't exactly a peaceful handover. They didn't discuss it. There was a battle, and the king lost, and if you like, the would-be the ancestor, distant ancestor, Henry, whatever it was, seventh or whatever it was, if you like, I can't remember, Henry the sixth or seventh, became king, and therefore Prince Charles is now king. So and that's before we start discussing about the empire, how they voluntarily got how Britain came to rule a quarter of the world, by the end of the 19th century. So there's an element of hypocrisy with it. But we've got to be prepared to answer that from the point of view of ourselves, yes, we're revolutionaries, but we don't want to have violence. But how does violence actually develop? It's because either repressive governments use violence in order to suppress movements, or those who own and control the wealth of the country use violence to defend themselves. That's what happens. And therefore, from that point of view, the movement itself, if you're going to really change society, you've got to be prepared to confront and defeat the violence which the old order, if you like, will actually use to try and defend themselves. That's the question. It's not the question that we want, violence. We don't. Far better if there's no violence, if it's peaceful. But at the same time, we have no illusions that the old ruling class will simply give up and say, we're not going to, you can have it all, and walk away. They're not going to do that. And this is the lesson which is particularly, if you like, apposite at the present time, because we're coming up to the 50th anniversary of the overthrow of the Allende government in Chile. In a few days' time will be the 50th anniversary. And that was a government which was a left government. It had a general program of change. It, if you like, didn't have a complete socialist program. It attempted to work within the system, but nevertheless, it had far-reaching changes, but it met with the resistance from the old ruling class. And at the same time, seeing in Chile, in the years, it was between 1970 and 1973, seeing the radicalization which was taking place, the reaction, the old ruling class was that preparing to if you like, to remove the Allende, this left government led by Allende. The working people were seeing that was happening. There were growing demands that they wanted to be armed by the Allende government because they could see what was happening. The coup wasn't a complete surprise. They could see what was actually coming, if you like, and they wanted to defeat it. And in the end, the military acted with the support, let's remember, of the ruling class in Chile, the support of the US imperialism, Britain, the other countries, they backed it. The US knew in advance what was going to happen. It was not accidental, this, but they used violence in order to not to overthrow the government and to, if you like, crush the movement which was developing. It's not the first time it's happened. I'm just mentioning it because we're coming up to the 50th anniversary in a few days' time. But it's a lesson because Allende didn't initiate the violence. It was the old ruling class initiating the violence in order to crush the movement. And that is why the mistake was made that they didn't go on the offensive against the ruling class in Chile. And we can use examples like that of Chile, because Chile is a particularly strong example of that, because Allende was elected, and had support of the parliament, all this sort of stuff, all the things they say you've got to be democratic. Well, he was democratic, but nevertheless he still got overthrown. And that's an important political point against the ruling classes, and one which we have got to make, that we draw, as I said before, we learn from the experiences of movements, both in Britain and internationally. But what we've got to do at the present time is to, if you like, develop the skills in how we have that dialogue with working people, or working with young people, with the broad masses who are facing the sharp, if you like, impact of this crisis, and a crisis which is going to continue. It may not go in a straight line. There'll be ups and downs in the economy and things like that. It's inevitable. But generally speaking, you know, we see we've entered into a period of great crisis, and if you like, skillfully to explain the need to break with capitalism, to give a vision of what can actually be done in the future. Because, you know, as well as talking about crisis, we've seen tremendous developments in science and technology in the recent period. If these developments were utilized, you know, in the interest of working people, life could very rapidly begin to be transformed. I mean, you look at many of the crises which we face in Britain and in other countries, say like, for instance, the housing crisis, that has got nothing to do with science and technology. It's all the science and technology to solve the housing crisis, but it's the system which is stopping it being solved. I mean, use that as a concrete example. Some things, yes, you've got to further develop science and technology, but housing, basic health care, no, that's absolutely, that could be solved. There's the science and technology to solve it. What's blocking it is the system. And by explaining these sort of questions, and then winning support for those ideas, but linking that to the idea of how we're going to build a movement which can actually achieve that is the key question. And the role of our party, if you like, in building such a movement and campaigning to win support for that program.
Thank you.